I never imagined that old age would feel this way, not because of the aches in my knees or the heaviness that comes over me when I climb the stairs too quickly, but because of the silence that fills my house in the evenings, a silence that seems to expand with every passing year, pressing against the walls and reminding me that there is no one left here to call my name. My name is Richard Mallory. I turned 76 last winter, and though people in the neighborhood still wave when I pass by, though the mailman sometimes lingers for a word or two at the gate, the truth is that my life has narrowed to a small circle of habits, the kind of rituals that feel more like lifelines than routines. Every morning I grind the same beans, boil the same kettle, set down the same chipped mug on the kitchen counter, and every morning I remember the way my wife Margaret used to hum while she prepared breakfast, a small sound that seemed to anchor the whole house. She has been gone for 8 years now, and though grief is supposed to soften, mine has settled like a permanent shadow, sometimes faint and sometimes overwhelming, but always there, reminding me of the years when life was warm and filled with ordinary joy. I was an engineer by trade, one of those men who believed that if you drew the lines carefully enough, if you measured the angles precisely, the world itself would hold together. For 4 decades I worked with bridges, tunnels, structures that were meant to endure, and I carried that same belief into my family life, thinking that with enough discipline, enough effort, the bonds between father and daughter would be as firm as steel. My daughter Elaine was the pride of my life, a child who loved books more than toys, who asked questions about everything, who once told me she wanted to build towers taller than the clouds. I thought our relationship was solid, even after Margaret died and the house grew quieter. I told myself that at least I still had Elaine, her husband Daniel, and the 2 grandchildren who, though distant, were still blood of my blood. Yet over the years, I began to notice that I was invited less often, that phone calls grew shorter, that my presence at family gatherings felt less like joy and more like obligation. I explained it away, telling myself they were busy with careers, with raising children, with managing a house in the suburbs that seemed to demand endless repairs. But there were moments when I caught an expression in Elaine's eyes, something cold and measuring, as if she were already calculating the cost of keeping an aging father close. Still, I held on to hope, because what else can a widower hold on to if not the dream that family remains family, that the bond of blood will not be traded for convenience? I told myself that if I remained generous, if I offered help when asked, if I smiled through the dismissive jokes about my memory lapses or the condescending remarks about my outdated clothes, then perhaps I would be included. Perhaps I would be seen, not as a burden, but as the man who once carried them through years of hard work and sacrifice. My savings were comfortable, nothing extravagant, just the accumulation of a life spent working and denying myself luxuries, and when Elaine hinted that tuition costs were heavy or that the roof needed replacement, I always found a way to help. Each check I wrote felt like a tether tying me to her life, and even though gratitude was thin, I convinced myself that love would return, that one day she would look at me not as an aging obligation, but as her father. Lately, however, the doubts have grown heavier. There are mornings when I sit at the kitchen table staring at the wall clock, listening to its measured ticking, and wonder whether Elaine still sees me as Richard the father or simply as Richard the account number. I notice how she looks at my house, the only real possession I have of value, a modest 2-story place with peeling paint but solid bones, and how Daniel's eyes linger on the garage, where I keep the few things that still matter to me. When they visit, which is not often, their smiles feel rehearsed, their conversations rushed, as though they are already halfway out the door. And yet, despite all the signals, despite the gnawing suspicion that I am being slowly pushed to the margins of their world, I cling to hope with a stubbornness that surprises even me. Perhaps it is because I cannot bear to admit that I might outlive my place in my own family, that I might become, as the man next door once said about his father, someone to be managed rather than loved. In the evenings I walk through the rooms, touching the furniture that Margaret and I chose together, the curtains she sewed by hand, the photographs of a life that once seemed secure. I pause at the mantel where a framed picture of Elaine as a child still stands, her gap-toothed smile beaming with a trust so pure it makes my chest ache. I remember the nights I stayed up late helping her with school projects, the afternoons at the park where she insisted I push her higher and higher on the swings, her laughter rising into the summer sky. I remember how Margaret would stand at the window, smiling at the sight of us, her hands folded around a cup of tea, as if to say, "This is happiness, this is what we build." I hold on to those memories as if they were proof that what is happening now cannot be real, that betrayal cannot grow from soil that once nourished so much love. Neighbors sometimes tell me I should travel, that I should join a community group or take up new hobbies, and though I nod politely, the truth is that I no longer crave adventures. What I crave is belonging, the simple comfort of being called upon, of being needed not for my money but for my presence. I would trade all the savings, all the possessions, just to hear Elaine say sincerely, "Dad, we want you with us, not because you can give, but because you are you." And so when she recently suggested that I accompany them on a trip, that I might benefit from a change of scenery, I felt something stir inside me, a mixture of hope and suspicion, excitement and dread. Part of me wanted to believe it was a gesture of reconciliation, that my daughter had finally remembered that her father was still here, still alive, still waiting to be included. Another part whispered that there might be something else behind it, some calculation hidden behind the warmth of her voice. But I silenced that part, because hope, even fragile and dangerous, is sometimes all an old man has left. I do not know what awaits me, but I know that as I sit in this house filled with memories and shadows, I'm willing to risk disappointment just to feel, even briefly, that I belong again. The introduction of an old man's life is not made of dramatic events or grand gestures. It is made of silence, of small rituals, of memories that refuse to fade, and of a desperate yearning for family ties that seem to be slipping away. And perhaps, without realizing it, I'm already standing at the threshold of a story I never wanted to live, a story where love and betrayal are so entangled that one cannot be told without the other. The day that would shift the fragile balance of my life began like any other, with the steady tick of the clock in the kitchen and the smell of coffee drifting through the house. But there was an unusual brightness in my chest, the kind of nervous energy that comes when something out of the ordinary is about to happen. Elaine had called the night before, with a tone that was unusually warm, almost affectionate, telling me that she and Daniel were planning a weekend trip to the city and thought it would do me good to come along, to stay in a hotel where I would be comfortable and perhaps even enjoy some time away from the monotonous routine of my little house. She had used words like relax, enjoy, and refresh. Phrases I had not heard from her in years, and though my first instinct was suspicion, I pushed it aside because the temptation to believe in her sincerity was too strong. I polished my shoes, pressed my best trousers, and even dug out the old blazer Margaret had once insisted I buy, the one she said made me look distinguished, though I had rarely worn it. I wanted to present myself as someone who belonged, someone who was still capable of walking beside his daughter without embarrassment. When their car pulled into the driveway, the sound of the engine echoing off the garage door, I felt the same anxious excitement I used to feel when Elaine visited during her college years, when she would bring laundry and stories, filling the house with youthful chaos. Daniel barely nodded when I greeted him, his eyes fixed on his phone, fingers tapping with irritation. But Elaine came forward with a quick hug that smelled of perfume and felt more like obligation than affection. Still, I let myself believe that perhaps she had softened. Perhaps the trip was her way of extending an olive branch. They insisted I sit in the back, and I didn't argue, telling myself it was because they wanted me to be comfortable. though the truth was that it made me feel like baggage rather than company. As we drove, I tried to start conversations about the grandchildren, asking how their studies were going, whether they were planning to visit for the summer, but Elaine's answers were short, distracted, and Daniel's occasional chuckles felt sharp as if mocking my attempts to bridge a gap that had long since widened into a canyon. The hours on the highway stretched out, and though they had spoken of a hotel where I could rest, they gave no details, only vague reassurances that it was all taken care of. I noticed how often Elaine glanced at Daniel, how their words sometimes dropped into hushed tones I wasn't meant to hear, and I tried to ignore the unease that curled in my stomach, reminding myself that suspicion was a poison that could turn even the most innocent gesture into something sinister. Eventually, fatigue weighed on me, and when Elaine handed me a small bottle of water and insisted I drink, I obeyed without question, not realizing until later how heavy my eyelids became, how the hum of the car blended with my drowsiness until the world slipped into darkness. I awoke to voices I did not recognize, the sound of footsteps echoing on tile, the smell of bleach and stale coffee in the air. My first thought was that we had arrived at the hotel, that perhaps they had checked me in while I dozed, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw not the soft glow of a lobby or the polished floor of a reception hall, but a stark room with metal chairs, peeling paint, and a bulletin board covered in flyers about meal schedules and addiction recovery meetings. A thin blanket lay folded on the cot beside me, and at the far end of the room a man in a worn jacket was asking for directions to the dining hall. My heart lurched, confusion flooding me, because nothing in this place resembled the promise of a hotel. When I stumbled toward the nearest desk, a woman in scrubs looked up with a mixture of indifference and faint irritation, as though she had seen this scene countless times. "You must be Mr. Mallory," she said, glancing at a clipboard. "Your daughter dropped you off this morning. Said you needed a safe place, that you'd be better here for a while." Her words struck me harder than any physical blow could have. I tried to correct her, to insist there must be a mistake, that Elaine had promised a hotel, that I had money to pay for my own room, but the woman only shrugged, pointing toward a pile of plastic bags where, she said, my belongings had been placed. When I opened the bag, my hands trembling, I found only a sweater, a pair of socks, and a bottle of generic pills. My wallet, my phone, even the watch Margaret had given me on our 40th anniversary, were gone. I stood frozen, the hum of the fluorescent lights drilling into my skull while fragments of memory returned. Elaine's insistence that I drink the water, the way my body had grown heavy, the hushed whispers between her and Daniel, the way they had not met my eyes as fatigue dragged me under. It all came together in one sickening realization. I had not been brought to a hotel but abandoned in a shelter, left behind like an unwanted parcel. The betrayal was so sharp I could not breathe, as though my chest had been hollowed out. I tried to tell myself there must be some explanation, some misunderstanding, but the evidence lay all around me. The cold bed, the pitying looks of staff, the absence of everything that was mine. I wandered into the common room where a handful of men sat slumped in chairs, their faces drawn by years of hard living. One of them, an older fellow with eyes like burned-out coals, looked at me and muttered, "Family dump you here, old man. Happens more than you'd think." His words cut deeper than he knew, because in that moment I realized that he had named the truth I had been too terrified to accept. Elaine had left me here deliberately. She had not lost track of me. She had not misunderstood my needs. She had made a choice to rid herself of her father by disguising abandonment as care. I tried to find a phone, desperate to call her, to demand an explanation, but the staff told me I had no number listed, no contact to reach, and when I insisted that I could recite my own daughter's phone number by heart, they exchanged glances, filled with that awful mixture of doubt and pity reserved for the very old. It dawned on me that she had prepared for this, that she had told them I was confused, forgetful, perhaps even suffering from dementia, so that my words would carry no weight. For the first time in my life, I felt the terrifying sensation of being erased. Not physically, for I was still standing there, but erased in credibility, in dignity, in the very eyes of others. I returned to the cot, sat down with my head in my hands, and tried to steady my breathing, but the air felt heavy, thick with the stench of disinfectant and despair. My mind raced through every memory of Elaine, from her first steps to her wedding day, trying to reconcile the little girl I had carried on my shoulders with the woman who had just abandoned me among strangers. There was no reconciling it. Something had shifted irrevocably, and I knew with a clarity as cold as ice that this was no mistake. I was not in a hotel, I was in a shelter, and my daughter had put me here. I sat on the narrow cot for what felt like hours, listening to the shuffle of feet in the hallway, the clatter of trays in the dining room, the indistinct murmur of voices that carried with them the weight of resignation, and the longer I sat there, the more the truth pressed down on me with suffocating force, for it was no longer possible to pretend that Elaine's act was a misunderstanding or some temporary arrangement. No, it was deliberate, calculated, and the humiliation of it began to spread through me like fire, burning not only my pride, but also the fragile hope that had sustained me through years of neglect. My first attempt at dignity was to rise and approach the desk again, asking firmly for a phone, insisting that I had the right to call my family, to speak to my daughter and demand an explanation, but the young man at the desk, barely older than my grandson, gave me a look that was half amusement, half pity, and told me I needed to calm down, that my daughter had already explained everything, that I was better off here where, as she had put it, he'll be safe, supervised, and won't have to struggle alone. The words, coming from his mouth but belonging to hers, cut me more deeply than I can describe, for in that moment I understood that Elaine had not only abandoned me but also rewritten me in the eyes of strangers as a helpless old man incapable of managing his own life. I tried to protest, to explain that I was not senile, that I paid my bills, that I kept my house in order, that I cooked for myself every day, but the staff exchanged knowing glances, the kind reserved for those convinced they are listening to a man. Slipping into confusion, and I realized with a sickening clarity that my words were powerless, that the very image of me had been poisoned before I even arrived. When I asked about my belongings, desperate to find my wallet or at least my phone, they told me calmly that nothing else had been left, only the plastic bag with the sweater and socks, and when I insisted there must have been more, they shrugged as though the question itself confirmed the daughter's story of a forgetful father inventing things that were not there. It was then that the true weight of my vulnerability descended upon me, heavier than any physical burden I'd carried in all my years, for in a single morning I had been stripped of identity, stripped of resources, and placed in a position where no one would believe my account of what had happened. Later in the dining hall, as I forced myself to swallow a bowl of watery soup surrounded by men who smelled of alcohol and despair, I heard the whispers. Another one dropped by his kids. One muttered to another. They all say the same. Confused. Can't manage. Better here than out there. They did not know my story, yet they knew it perfectly, for it was written in the way I'd been delivered to that place. I wanted to shout, to tell them I was different, that I had worked 40 years building bridges that still stood, that I had raised a daughter, paid off a home, lived honorably. But the truth that silenced me was the recognition that I was not different in their eyes. I was just another old man left behind, another burden disguised as a father. That realization was the first true humiliation, sharper even than the moment I'd opened the bag to find my possessions gone, because it meant that my daughter's betrayal had already merged me with a category of the discarded. That night, lying on the cot with the thin blanket pulled to my chin, I tried to piece together the logic of what Elaine and Daniel had done. Why a shelter? Why not a nursing home or some assisted living facility? Why this harsh, abrupt abandonment? The only answer that surfaced, heavy and undeniable, was money. A nursing home required contracts, medical evaluations, monthly payments that would trace back to them. A shelter, however, required nothing but a drop-off and a signature on a clipboard. It was free, impersonal, and final. They could rid themselves of me without a cent spent, without responsibility, leaving me to fade quietly into the background noise of society's forgotten. The knowledge curdled inside me, part rage and part despair, and as I turned on the cot, unable to sleep, I remembered the way Elaine's eyes had once lit up when I came home from work, the way she used to climb into my lap and beg for stories, and I asked myself again and again how that child had grown into a woman capable of such cruelty. The next morning I made another attempt at reclaiming myself. I approached the director, an older woman with tired eyes, and told her firmly that I needed to leave, that I was not meant to be there, that I had money and a home, and I simply needed a phone to call my bank. She listened with polite patience, then handed me a form and said, "If you want to leave, you'll need to provide identification or someone to verify your information." Identification, of course, the very thing Elaine had ensured I no longer had. I explained that my daughter had kept my wallet, that it must have been an oversight, but the woman's look told me she had heard this too many times to believe it. I was trapped in a vicious circle. Without documents, I was no one, and because I was no one, every word I spoke sounded like confusion. That was the second humiliation, a deeper cut than the first, because it revealed the depth of Elaine's planning. She had not only removed me physically from my home, but also stripped me of the tools I would need to reclaim my place. As the day dragged on, I began to sense that some of the staff regarded me with suspicion, as though I were a man caught in denial about his condition, and each time I tried to insist on my competence, their smiles grew thinner, their tones more patronizing. I overheard one of them say to another, "His daughter told us he has memory lapses, insists everything's fine, but he doesn't even remember handing over his wallet." I wanted to scream that it was a lie, that I remembered perfectly, that she had taken it from me while I slept, but to argue would have only confirmed their assumptions. The impotence of that realization was unbearable, and in my frustration I slammed my hand on the table in the common room, which immediately drew wary glances and a warning from a guard to settle down. In that moment I understood that any expression of anger, however justified, would be recorded not as righteous but as symptomatic, proof that I was indeed the confused, unstable man Elaine had described. That was the third humiliation, the cruelest yet, for it meant that even my resistance could be turned against me. That night I lay awake listening to the coughing and muttering of the men around me, the rattle of pipes in the ceiling, and I realized that I was now in a place where dignity had no currency, where years of labor and sacrifice meant nothing, where the title of father or engineer or husband had been erased by a single signature on a shelter intake form. I wept quietly, not just for myself, but for Margaret, who would never have believed our daughter capable of such treachery, and I promised her memory that I would not let this be the end, that I would find a way back, even if every step forward felt like walking through a storm of disbelief and scorn. On the third day of my forced stay in the shelter, when my spirit had already begun to bend under the constant weight of disbelief, a shift occurred, not in the form of mercy, but in the form of a revelation that made the ground beneath me tremble. A social worker came in, a young woman with files stacked in her arms, her face weary in that way of people who see too many stories of decline and disappointment each day. She sat across from me, adjusting her glasses, and spoke in the calm tone one reserves for patients, not equals. "Mr. Mallory," she said, "we've been reviewing your case. Your daughter submitted some documentation to the hospital downtown prior to bringing you here. According to the notes, there are concerns about your memory and judgment, signs of early-stage dementia. She felt it was best for you to be somewhere supervised until guardianship could be arranged. At that word, guardianship, something inside me froze. It was as though all the suspicions that had clawed at the edges of my mind had suddenly coalesced into undeniable form. This was not abandonment born of frustration or neglect. This was a deliberate strategy to strip me of legal agency, to seize control of not only my daily existence but also the savings, the house, every scrap of independence I had left. I wanted to shout at her, to accuse Elaine of lies, to demand that my competence be recognized, but the woman's face remained placid, professional, as if bracing against the storm of yet another angry father insisting he was fine. She tapped her papers, emphasizing that this is preliminary, of course, and nothing has been decided yet, but your daughter's statements are taken seriously, especially since she has provided examples. I asked, my voice breaking, "What kind of examples?" And she flipped through the file, reading aloud notes that sounded like grotesque distortions of my life. "Forgot to turn off the stove. Nearly caused a fire," she recited. "Confused days of the week. Got lost walking back from the grocery store. Attempted to withdraw money twice in the same day. Denied it when confronted." Each claim landed like a stone, not because they were true, but because they were plausible enough in the eyes of a stranger. I knew I had never left the stove on, knew I had never been lost in my own neighborhood, but how could I prove it? Margaret was gone. My neighbors saw me less often, and in the vacuum of evidence, Elaine's words became the reality that officials would accept. In that moment, I felt the terror of invisibility more acutely than ever before. The realization that my identity could be rewritten, not by my actions, but by the testimony of someone I trusted most. The room spun with the weight of it, and I leaned forward, clutching the table as though I might slide into nothingness if I did not hold on. I told the social worker that I wanted to be tested, formally, by doctors, by anyone qualified, that I demanded an evaluation, but she only nodded in that way that says, "Yes, we'll see," without any urgency. She concluded our conversation by assuring me that shelters often provided a temporary holding space until more permanent arrangements could be made. More permanent arrangements. Those words rattled in my skull like a death sentence. I had not only been abandoned, I'd been recast as incompetent, stripped of credibility, and positioned on a conveyor belt that led directly to the forfeiture of my freedom. That night I lay awake on the cot, the smell of mildew and disinfectant heavy in the air, and I realized that passivity would be my undoing. If I waited for Elaine's plan to play out, I would wake one morning to find my accounts frozen, my house signed away, and myself locked in some institution where every protest would be recorded as agitation. It was no longer a question of dignity, but of survival, and survival demanded allies. The following day, when a local priest came to speak with residents, offering comfort to those who had no one left, I approached him quietly, almost ashamed, and poured out my story. To my surprise, he did not look at me with pity, but with sharp concern, the concern of someone who recognized both injustice and danger. He told me he believed me, that families sometimes cloaked greed in the language of care, and he offered to connect me with an attorney who occasionally volunteered for the parish, someone who knew how to navigate the maze of guardianship laws and property disputes. For the first time in days, I felt a faint flicker of hope. Fragile, but enough to keep me standing. As I waited for that connection to be made, I noticed how quickly despair could turn into resolve when a single person believed in you. I began to study the shelter staff, memorizing their routines, searching for opportunities to use the phone or slip out unnoticed. My hands shook when I finally dialed the number the priest had given me, but the voice on the other end, calm, steady, professional, told me I was not yet erased, not yet silenced. The attorney listened, asked careful questions, and promised to meet me discreetly to review the situation. Hanging up, I felt the first breath of freedom enter my lungs again, though it was laced with the knowledge that the battle ahead would be brutal. The midpoint of my ordeal had arrived, and it was not only a crisis of circumstance, but of identity. I was no longer simply an old man abandoned by his daughter. I was a man who had been deliberately recast as incompetent, and unless I fought, that false identity would become permanent. The betrayal was complete, but so too was my resolve, and in that collision of despair and determination, the true story began to take shape. The days that followed unfolded with a grim clarity, as if the veil that had once softened Elaine's intentions had been torn away, leaving me staring directly at the naked machinery of her betrayal. The priest kept his word and arranged a meeting with the attorney, a man named Harris who, though younger than I expected, carried himself with the steady calm of someone used to listening to tangled stories of family treachery. He met me discreetly in the corner of the parish office, his notebook open, his eyes watchful, and as I recounted everything from the phone call inviting me on the trip to the moment I awoke in the shelter, I could feel the trembling in my own voice. Yet Harris did not interrupt with skepticism or impatience. Instead, he leaned forward and asked precise questions, each one aimed at drawing out details that I had not realized were important. What date had Elaine invited me? Did she provide food or drink during the trip? When was the last time I physically held my wallet? Did anyone at the shelter see her drop me off? As I answered, I began to understand the shape of the trap that had been laid for me, and more importantly, the faint outlines of a possible escape. Harris explained that guardianship cases were built not only on medical evaluations, but also on testimony from relatives and documentation of supposed lapses. If Elaine had already submitted claims about me leaving the stove on or getting lost, then she was laying the groundwork for a petition to the court. Once that petition was accepted, she could be named my legal guardian, which would grant her immediate access to my finances and the right to determine where I lived. "It's not just about keeping you in a shelter," Harris said quietly. "It's about consolidating control. Once she has that, you'll find it nearly impossible to undo." His words chilled me, not because I hadn't suspected them, but because hearing them confirmed by someone who knew the law stripped away any lingering hope that this was a temporary cruelty. Elaine was not improvising. She was executing a plan. The second blow came when Harris checked the public records for me. Using his laptop, he pulled up a database of property deeds and banking notes, and within minutes he found that a request had already been made to freeze one of my accounts pending evaluation of competency. The request had not yet been approved, but the fact that it existed told me everything. Elaine and Daniel had wasted no time. While I sat in the shelter, stripped of dignity, they had been moving pieces on the board to strip me of everything else. My stomach clenched as I thought of the house, the one place where Margaret's presence still lingered in every curtain and photograph, the only refuge I had left. Would they take that too? Harris nodded soberly when I asked. "It's likely already in their sights. Once guardianship is granted, they can petition to sell the property, claiming it's too much for you to maintain. You'd be moved to a facility, and the house would be liquidated." I pressed my hands together to stop the trembling, but I could not stop the wave of grief that washed over me at the thought of strangers walking through those rooms, erasing 40 years of family life for profit. The third blow arrived from within the shelter itself. One of the staff members, a weary man who had been kinder to me than most, let slip that he had overheard Elaine speaking to the director during intake. She had said, almost casually, that I wasn't safe with money anymore, that I had been taken advantage of by neighbors and scammed by fraudulent calls, all of which were lies. I had never been scammed, never given money to anyone outside the family, but by planting those seeds, she had given the shelter staff a lens through which to interpret my every word. No wonder they looked at me as if I were a confused old fool when I insisted I had money, insisted I had a home. They had been told in advance to discount everything I said. That revelation left me reeling, because it meant Elaine's campaign against me was not confined to documents and courts. She was reshaping my identity in the minds of every stranger who might later be called as a witness. Harris urged me to act quickly, to gather whatever evidence I could before her petition advanced. The priest agreed to testify that I had spoken coherently and lucidly, that I had sought him out intentionally and recounted my story with consistency. But I knew I needed more. One night after lights out in the shelter, I sat in the dim common room scribbling notes on scraps of paper torn from an old flyer, recording everything I remembered in painstaking detail. The date Elaine had called, the clothes she wore when she picked me up, the exact words she used when handing me the bottle of water, the way Daniel avoided my gaze, the moment I woke to fluorescent lights and a stranger's indifferent voice. I wrote it all down because I feared that soon my own words would be dismissed, my memory declared unreliable, and these notes might be the only thread connecting me to the truth. But humiliation did not loosen its grip. The more I tried to assert myself, the more the shelter staff treated me with that suffocating mix of politeness and dismissal. One afternoon, when I asked again for access to a phone, the director smiled tightly and said, "Mr. Mallory, we understand you're anxious, but your daughter has assured us she's handling everything. It's best if you rest and let her take care of you." Her tone was final, maternal, as though speaking to a stubborn child, and I felt the heat rise to my face, not just from anger, but from the degradation of being spoken to as if I no longer had the right to speak for myself. It was in that moment that I realized Elaine's strategy was working, for even here, among people who had never known me before, she had managed to reduce me to a caricature, the confused, unstable old man who needed to be managed. The weight of those days pressed harder with each revelation. I thought of Margaret constantly, of how she would have fought like a lioness if anyone had tried to strip dignity from her, and I wondered what she would think now of the daughter we had raised. Had we been blind to the seeds of selfishness? Had grief twisted Elaine into someone unrecognizable? Or had the potential always been there, waiting for an opportunity? These questions haunted me as I drifted through the routines of the shelter, lining up for meals, listening to the coughs of men who had lost everything long before me, staring at the cracked ceiling above my cot as if it held answers. The final and most crushing escalation came not from Elaine's lies, but from the realization of how thoroughly she had isolated me. When Harris attempted to contact my bank directly to put a hold on any changes to my accounts, he discovered that my contact information had already been altered. The phone number on file was no longer mine. It was Elaine's. The mailing address had been changed to hers as well. For all practical purposes, she had already stepped into my identity, intercepting every notice, every alert, ensuring that I remained ignorant until it was too late. The violation was total, and as Harris explained the difficulty of reversing such changes, I felt as though my very life had been stolen piece by piece while I slept in the back of a car. That night I could not stop pacing the narrow hall outside the dormitory. The other residents muttered at me to quiet down, but I could not. The enormity of what was happening pressed against my skull until I thought it might crack. Elaine was not simply discarding me. She was erasing me. And the worst part, the part that gnawed at my gut and made me tremble with rage, was that she would be believed, while I, the man who had built bridges that still carried thousands of people safely each day, would be dismissed as a senile old fool. That knowledge, cruel and undeniable, transformed my grief into something sharper, harder. For the first time since Margaret's death, I felt the pulse of anger strong enough to keep me upright. They had underestimated me. Elaine and Daniel both. They thought sedation and paperwork would suffice to bury me. But I was not yet buried, and though the blows had come one after another, financial, emotional, reputational, I was still standing, and I was beginning to plan, not just escape, but retribution. Harris moved faster than I thought possible. and in the span of 2 days he had turned my scattered notes and the priest's promise into filings with teeth, first by lodging an emergency petition to block any action on guardianship until a clinical evaluation could be performed by an independent neurologist of his choosing, then by sending formal notices to the bank and the county recorder enjoining them from honoring address changes, freezes, or transfers that had not originated from me directly, and while I had prepared myself to be ignored yet again. The language of court orders has a way of changing how people listen, because the shelter director's voice softened when she read the stamped injunction and the staff who had spoken. To me, with a courteous condescension, now offered coffee and a quiet office where the doctor could examine me, and I sat there under the fluorescent lights, answering memory questions, subtracting sevens, recalling words in order and in reverse, reciting the month and the year and the city, naming presidents, explaining my routines, and then, because Harris had urged me to insist on it, I told the neurologist the story from beginning to end without stumbling, including the bottle of water. Elaine pressed into my hand, the sweetness on my tongue that was not sugar, the heaviness that followed, the gap of blackness, and the waking in a room that smelled of bleach and weariness, and he nodded with a clinical gravity that felt like rescue when he asked whether I consented to a blood panel, because sedatives leave traces, and time had not yet erased them. By dusk, we had a report that did not simply call me competent. It called me unimpaired for the purposes of personal affairs and financial decision-making, and noted the presence of a benzodiazepine in my system inconsistent with any of the medications listed under my name. A small paragraph of medical prose that carried the weight of a bridge girder placed exactly where a span is weakest. Harris did not waste the momentum. He sent a preservation letter for the shelter's intake logs and video footage, and within hours we were watching a grainy recording on the director's office monitor where Elaine stood at the desk, hair smooth and voice brisk, signing a form and pointing in my direction, while Daniel hovered behind her with the practiced impatience of a man who wants distasteful tasks over quickly. And when the clerk slid the clipboard across the counter, the camera caught the angled scrawl of Elaine's name and the notation beside it that might as well have been a dagger, drop-off confirmed. And as the image stabilized and the timestamp ticked forward, I watched my own bent figure being led through a door, my head lolling in a way that even I did not recognize as mine. And a sound escaped me that I did not know I had carried, a low animal breath that had no words, because the thing that hurts most in betrayal is not the practical loss, but the proof that the person you loved prepared the moment in advance. Harris copied the footage to a drive and added affidavits to his growing stack, and when he put a hand on my shoulder, he did not promise victory. He promised combat with rules, which in that moment was more valuable than hope. It was late when we left the shelter, almost night, the air holding the faint damp of an approaching storm, and I asked him to take me home, not because I thought it would be safe, but because some part of me needed to stand on my own threshold and refuse to be erased. And as we turned onto my street, the headlights caught the white flank of a moving van nosed into my driveway like a beached vessel, its ramp down, its cargo belly open to the night, and I felt the old engineer in me calculate. Angles again. Not of steel, but of consequences, because to step out of the car empty-handed would be to invite another humiliation. And Harris, who seemed to think 3 moves ahead, reached into his briefcase and handed me the temporary order, staying any removal or disposal of my property pending a hearing, and then he phoned the non-emergency police line and spoke with the calm of a man who knew which words opened doors. We walked up the drive just as Daniel appeared at the mouth of the van with a box I recognized from the hall closet, the one Margaret had labeled in her careful hand, winter linens, and his expression shifted from bland efficiency to a smile pressed into politeness, and then, seeing Harris and the patrol car rolling to a stop at the curb, to something hard and small, Elaine stood on the porch with a ring of keys and a clipboard as if cosplaying a property manager, and for an instant I saw the child. She had been flicker through her eyes, not with remorse but with calculation as she stepped forward and began to speak first, telling the officers that her father was confused, that she was in the middle of relocating him to a safe place, that we should keep voices down because agitation was a symptom and she didn't want to upset me. But Harris lifted the order like a mirror, and her words died when she caught her own outline reflected in the stamp and the signature. Then he handed the second page to the sergeant, who read faster than I expected and signaled his partner to stand between the van and the front door, and I, who had been turned into a case file and a diagnosis and a problem to be solved, stepped next to Harris and spoke in a voice I hardly recognized as mine, slow and even but carrying to the sidewalk, that they would put the boxes down, that they would hand me the keys, that they would return my wallet and my watch and the folder from the desk where I kept the house papers, and that there would be no more lies told about fires and lost streets, because the doctor's report and the video and the shelter log said what needed to be said, and the rest I would say for myself. Elaine's mouth tightened, and for a moment her mask slipped and the old resentment flared, the kind that believes love is a ledger and childhood a debt unpaid, and she tried one last maneuver, telling the sergeant that the guardianship papers were already in motion, and that for my safety it would be best if she retained custody of certain documents until the court could sort things out. But Harris had anticipated it and produced the neurologist's letter, along with the injunctions which together formed a gate she could not push through, and the sergeant, who had surely stood on too many porches like mine, said with weary finality that the law for this night was clear, that property would not be removed, that the keys would be returned to the legal owner, that any dispute would proceed through the morning docket, and when Daniel muttered that this was ridiculous and started to shoulder past with the box, the partner shifted a step, and the sound of the cardboard settling back onto the ramp might as well have been a verdict. I asked for my watch, not because of its monetary value, but because Margaret's hand had fastened it around my wrist the day we cleared our mortgage, and when Elaine hesitated, I felt something rise in me like a tide. Not anger now, but a steadier force, the refusal to let her write the end of my life as a footnote to her convenience, and I said her name the way I used to when she was little and about to step into the street without looking both ways, and she reached into her pocket and placed the watch in my palm with an expression I could not read, part contempt and part fear of a mirror that shows you a face you don't want to admit is yours. Inside the house, the air was wrong. The modest order I kept bent into a shape that did not belong to me. Drawers emptied onto tables, my papers stacked with a mover's indifference, and we walked room by room with the officers as witnesses while Harris dictated a quick inventory of the obvious violations, and though shame tried to close my throat, I made myself open closets and cupboards, because nothing is taken back by pretending it was not stolen, and when we reached the bedroom, I saw that the photograph of Margaret on the dresser had been removed from its frame, the paper backing torn, and for a moment the room swayed, not from age or sedatives, but from the way grief can arrive without warning like a wave through a cracked sea wall. Steadied myself on the dresser, and then turned to Elaine and told her, not with theatrics, but with the simple precision of an engineer marking a line in chalk, that she would not set foot in this house again without a court order, that she would not speak to my bank or my doctors in my name, that any document she had submitted would be answered with documents of my own, and if she persisted, I would file for a protective order and for damages for conversion and fraud, and any other name the law gave to what she had done. She tried to summon tears, or perhaps they were real and had nothing to do with remorse, and she said that she had only wanted to stabilize things, that I was stubborn and proud and lonely and would not accept help, and I told her that help which begins with a drug and ends with a shelter is not help but convenience, and that words like guardianship and safety are clean coats thrown over dirty work. The officers walked them to the van and watched as the ramp folded up and the engine coughed and the vehicle rolled away into the dark. And Harris, who had said little after the orders spoke for us, turned to me and asked if I wanted a locksmith, and I said yes, because there are doors you close to survive and doors you lock to begin again, and while the man drilled the deadbolt and fitted a new cylinder, I sat at the kitchen table with Margaret's watch, warm against my skin, and signed papers, placing my accounts under a new address and authorizing alerts to Harris's office, and I initialed a statement revoking any informal permissions Elaine might claim, and I signed a letter to my doctor making explicit that no one had proxy rights in my care, and each signature felt like driving a piling down into bedrock. When the house was finally quiet and the officers gone, Harris gathered his files and told me to sleep if I could, that in the morning we would file to dismiss the guardianship petition and serve notice to cease and desist, and he paused at the doorway as if deciding whether to offer comfort, then settled on respect, saying that whatever else came, I had already done the part that could not be done for me, which was to stand up on my own floor and say my name out loud. I did not sleep. I sat at the window until the first grey edged the hedges and the robins started their thin daybreak song, and in that fragile hour the house felt like itself again, not healed but defended, and I understood that the climax of this story was not a shouted accusation or a dramatic arrest, but a series of exact acts performed in the right order until the truth outweighed the lie, and I whispered to Margaret that I had brought her watch home, that the shelves would hold again, that the lines I once drew on paper had become lines I now drew around my life, and that I was not done. The final chapter of this ordeal did not arrive with fireworks or shouting, but with a quieter reckoning, the kind that seeps into a man's bones and forces him to sit very still and take stock of what has been lost and what has been salvaged. After the court confirmed the sale of the house and the funds cleared into my account, I moved fully into my new apartment by the lake, and for the first time in years, I began to live not as a father weighed down by obligations or as a discarded burden shuffled from place to place, but simply as myself. The walls of the apartment were bare at first, and the silence was sharp, but slowly I filled the space with objects that belonged only to me. New chairs, a sturdy desk, fresh curtains that let in the afternoon sun. I placed Margaret's photograph by the window where the light caught her smile every morning, and though the ache of her absence never left, it no longer crushed me beneath its weight. Instead, it reminded me of the love I had once been given freely, without calculation or demand, and that reminder was enough to carry me through the loneliest hours. Elaine and Daniel tried once more to reach me. Letters came, half threatening and half pleading, promising reconciliation one day and accusing me of betrayal the next. I read them once and then burned them in the sink, watching the smoke curl upward like ghosts best left behind. They had already taken enough of my time, enough of my spirit. I would not let their words colonize my new life. I knew they might circle back again, that resentment and greed are hungers that never truly die. But I had locked my doors, changed my numbers, and, more importantly, I had changed the place they held in my heart, from central to non-existent. That was a door they could no longer force open. At first, the quiet of independence was disorienting. I had lived so long under the shadow of being someone's father, someone's provider, someone's mark for exploitation, that the absence of those roles felt almost like emptiness. But with time, the quiet became a gift. I joined a small reading group at the library, found myself speaking with neighbors about gardening and history, and on Sundays I sat in the back pew of the parish where the priest had first believed my story when no one else would. He shook my hand firmly each time, as if reminding me that belief, once given, can save a man from disappearing. And I found, to my own surprise, that I laughed more easily than I had in years, laughed without waiting for the sting of mockery to follow. Sometimes at night I thought of my grandchildren, Hazel and Reginald, and a sorrow stirred in me that I may never see them again, that their image of me might be forever colored by the lies their parents had woven. I hoped that one day they would find their way back, if not to me, then at least to the truth. But I also understood that life is too short to wait at windows for faces that may never appear. So I let them go in my heart, just as I had let their parents go, and I wished them peace even as I doubted they wished the same for me. The greatest change was within myself. For years I had believed that age meant only decline, that I would shrink into a smaller and smaller life until it ended in silence. But this ordeal, cruel as it was, had pulled me back into a sharper kind of living. It forced me to fight, to speak, to reclaim my own name, and in doing so, it gave me back a dignity I'd almost forgotten I possessed. I was no longer simply surviving the absence of family. I was choosing the presence of self-respect. That was a different kind of wealth, one that Elaine and Daniel could never touch, no matter how many signatures they forged or stories they invented. On the evening the sale was finalized, I sat by the lake as the sun went down, the water catching fire in streaks of red and gold. I thought of Margaret and whispered to her, as I often did, telling her that the house was gone, that the accounts were safe, that her watch still ticked on my wrist, keeping time not only for me, but for the promise I had made to her to stand tall, even in her absence. I told her that the chapter with Elaine was closed, that I had not let our daughter bury me alive, and that though I carried sorrow, I also carried pride. The wind shifted, rustling the reeds, and for a moment it felt like her answer, not in words, but in the warmth of the evening itself. I did not win a family back, and I did not emerge unscarred, but I did win something more honest, a life that belonged to me again. I understood now that blood alone does not define family, that love is measured not in words spoken at crowded tables, but in the choices made when no one is watching. Elaine chose betrayal. I chose survival. And survival, when seasoned with clarity, becomes its own quiet form of victory. So the story ends not with reunion or forgiveness, but with a man who refused to vanish. I sit in my chair, watching the lake shift with the seasons, knowing that I am still here, that I am still myself, and that is enough.